Who has seen the wind? Neither you nor I. But when the trees bow down their heads, the wind is passing by. Hello once again. I'm Don Jackson with the heartbeat of the internet. It's the age-old question. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it fall, does it still make a noise? One doesn't have to see the thing to believe that it exists. Our spiritual belief is the perfect example of having faith in a higher power that is unseen. We may never look upon the face of our Creator, but we can see the Creator's thoughts. When we look upon the face of a flower as it blooms for the first time and scents the air, or when we see it revealed in the majesty of a mighty tree as it reaches for the sky. This hour, the story of the 3 trees. In the fantastic world of Middle-earth that J.R.R. Tolkien created, ancient trees called Ents were wise tree herders. 2 of the hobbits in the 2 Towers have met up with a creature called Treebeard, one of the oldest living Ents of the forest, a tree herd for lack of a better description. And this is what he said. We keep off strangers and the foolhardy, and we train and we teach, we walk and we weed. Sheep get like shepherd, and shepherds like sheep, it is said, but slowly, and neither have long in the world. It is quicker and closer with trees and Ents, and they walk down the ages together. Most of the trees are just trees, of course, but many are half awake. Some are quite wide awake, and you find that some have bad hearts. Nothing to do with their wood. Some of my kin look just like trees now and need something great to rouse them. And they speak only in whispers. Elves began it, of course, waking trees and teaching them to speak and learning their tree talk. They always wished to talk to everything, the old elves did. Time was when I could walk and sing all day and hear no more than the echo of my own voice in the hollow hills and the smell of the air. I used to spend a week just breathing." End quote. You know, it does not surprise me in the least that J.R.R. Tolkien gave voice to the ancient trees of the forests of Middle-earth. We, as a people, have always ascribed many supernatural powers to trees. And it may be because of the slow growth of forests, the peace we find deep within the dark woods, their shapes, the way they have grown, the life that calls the tree its home. We have many superstitions associated with trees, but none as powerful as this first one. In the Reader's Digest collection, Why in the World Was This About Why We Knock on Wood? And I quote, "We've all had the feeling that things are sometimes going too well, that by overconfidence or idle boasting we may stretch our luck too far and bring some terrible retribution. An old proverb says, 'He who talks much of happiness summons grief.' The idea that joyful events in life may suddenly run in reverse and end in misfortune or tragedy is closely linked with the superstition of touching or knocking on wood. That action is so commonplace that we scarcely recognize it as superstition. Any statement that may be seen to tempt the fates is almost inevitably followed, and swiftly, by a search for the nearest piece of wood. The belief that touching wood will placate the evil spirits goes back to pagan times, when trees were held sacred as the abode of gods. These gods commanded the trees to spring into life and to lose their leaves. They chose some trees to be evergreen, a sign of immortality. Touching a tree was a mark of respect to the gods, a request for a favor to be granted, or thanks for one already given. The Druids in Europe had a lot of respect for their trees and even worshipped them outright. The oak was the most revered, and newlyweds danced round the tree for good luck in their marriage. Writer Paul Hyland mused about how a person could make a tree. Take wood, seasoned or green, rough-hewn or planed. Take first 1 4-square beam, twice a man's height, then graft a second, half that, onto it, crosswise, and near the top, cunningly joined. Dig socket. Plant upright. Hope it will root. Hope sap will rise. If not, keep tools at hand, and when the time is ripe, nail up the fruit. And that's how easy it is. Back to this article in the Reader's Digest collection. After the crucifixion, pagan reverence was joined by Christian belief that because Christ died on a wooden cross, all wood was holy. Many people wore wooden crosses, touching them as a sign of penitence if they caught themselves gloating or making a rash statement of intent. They felt, too, that Christ had called upon them to lead humble lives. Lack of humility was not only tempting fate, it was a sin. The native North Americans said that the maple tree is the king of all trees. They say that when the maple tree dies from the top down, then major earth changes are on their way. These native peoples believe the changes are already here. And back to this brief article in the Reader's Digest edition, Why in the World? The superstitious aren't happy about touching just any piece of wood. If no living tree is at hand, they will try to find unpainted wood, touching or knocking upon it, not once, but 3 times. It's interesting to note that touching wood for safety features in many children's hide-and-seek games. A player gets home safe from capture by touching base, usually a tree or wooden post. End quote. David Wagner wrote, "If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you." There is a beautiful legend which comes to us from medieval times. An aged hermit living in the Egyptian desert planted an olive tree near his cave. He then prayed to God for rain, and it came and watered his olive tree. He thought that some warm sun to swell its buds would be advisable, so he prayed, and the sun shone. However, after a time, his small tree began to wilt, and the hermit thought that a little frost would help to brace it. He prayed for frost, and it came. After that, he believed a hot southerly wind would suit his tree, and for this he prayed. The south wind came, blew upon his tree, and it died. Sometime later, he visited a fellow hermit, and at his door was a flourishing olive tree. He asked how his friend had managed to grow it, and the other hermit replied, "I planted it. God blessed it, and it grew." "Ah, brother," replied the first hermit, "I too planted an olive tree, and when I thought it needed water, I asked God for rain, and it came. When I thought that it wanted sun, I asked for this, and the sun shone. And when I deemed that it needed strength, I prayed, and frost came. God gave me all I demanded for my tree, and yet it is dead." "And I, my brother," replied the other hermit, "I left my tree in God's hands, for he knew what it wanted better than I." End quote. An excerpt from the 1989 edition of the Friendship Book of Francis Gay. Here's an excerpt from a popular novel that alludes to another tree and the beliefs that surround it, and I quote, "All was dimness beneath a canopy of luxuriant leaf, and we were surrounded by the sound of softly dripping water. Wild red hyacinth grew where the sun could penetrate the precious gloom. I saw thin yew trees, the species so sacred to the dead and to the magician, and I saw many lilies lost in the choking grass. It could not have been more lulling and dreamy had it been a purposeful Japanese garden." Anne Rice, from her novel Merrick. Again I quote, "Have you heard the legend of the dogwood? At the time of the crucifixion, the dogwood was just as tall as any of the forest trees. It was so strong and straight that it was chosen as timber for the cross. To be used for such a cruel purpose greatly distressed the tree. But Jesus sensed this and promised, 'Never again shall the dogwood tree grow large enough to be used as a cross. Henceforth it shall be slender, bent, and twisted, and its blossoms shall be in the form of a cross with 2 long and 2 short petals. In the center of the outer edge of each petal there will be nail prints marked with rust, and in the center of the flower will be a crown of thorns, and all who see it will remember. If you look closely at the blossom of the dogwood, you will see these marks." An excerpt from the 1990 edition of the Friendship Book of Francis Gay. Khalil Gibran, in Sand and Foam, wrote, "Trees are poems that the earth writes upon the sky. We fell them down and turn them into paper that we may record our emptiness." I promised 3 trees. Once there were 3 trees on a hill in the woods. They were discussing their hopes and dreams when the first tree said, "Someday I hope to be a treasure chest. I could be filled with gold, silver, and precious gems. I could be decorated with intricate carving, and everyone would see the beauty." Then the second tree said, "Someday I will be a mighty ship. I will take kings and queens across the waters and sail to the corners of the world. Everyone will feel safe in me because of the strength of my hull." Finally, the third tree said, "I want to grow to be the tallest and straightest tree in the forest. People will see me on top of the hill and look up to my branches and think of the heavens and God and how close to them I am reaching. I will be the greatest tree of all time, and people will always remember me." After a few years of praying that their dreams would come true, a group of woodsmen came upon the trees. When one came to the first tree, he said, "This looks like a strong tree. I think I should be able to sell the wood to a carpenter." and began cutting it down. Tree was happy because he knew that the carpenter would make him into a treasure chest. At the second tree, the woodsman said, "This looks like a strong tree. I should be able to sell it to the shipyard." The second tree was happy because he knew he was on his way to becoming a mighty ship. When the woodsman came upon the third tree, Tree was frightened because he knew that if they cut him down, his dreams would not come true. One of the woodsmen said, "I don't need anything special for my tree, so I'll take this one." And he cut it down. When the first tree arrived at the carpenter's, he was made into a feed box for animals. He was then placed in a barn and filled with hay. This was not at all what he had prayed for. The second tree was cut and made into a small fishing boat. His dreams of being a mighty ship and carrying kings had come to an end. The third tree was cut into large pieces and left alone in the dark. The years went by, and the trees forgot about their dreams. But the story doesn't end there. The conclusion shortly. Why does the pine tree stand so near the road? I wish it stood a little back, perhaps in the hollow behind. Everyone equipped with rope and axe will want to cut it down. Poem by Chol Chong, translated from Korean into English by Kevin O'Rourke. Our story tells us there were 3 trees, each with a dream deep inside the wood. The first wanted to be a treasure chest. The second wanted to be used to build a mighty ship. And the third wanted to be left to grow on the hill to become the tree that stood closest to heaven. The first is made into a feed box for animals and left in a barn. The second is made into a small fishing boat, not at all what he wanted. And the third was just cut into planks and left in storage in the dark. The fate of the 3 trees. Then, one day, a man and woman came to the barn. She gave birth, and they placed the baby in the hay in the feed box that was made from the first tree. The man wished he could have made a crib for the baby, but this manger would have to do. The tree could feel the importance of this event and knew that it had held the greatest treasure of all time. Years later, a group of men got in the fishing boat made from the second tree. One of them was tired and went to sleep. While they were out on the water, a great storm arose, and the tree didn't think it was strong enough to keep the men safe. The men woke the sleeping man, and he stood and said, "Peace." And the storm stopped. At this time, the tree knew that it had carried the King of Kings. Finally, someone came and got the third tree. It was carried through the streets as the people mocked the man who was carrying it. When they came to a stop, the man was nailed to the tree and raised in the air to die at the top of a hill. When Sunday came, the tree came to realize that it was strong enough to stand at the top of the hill and be as close to heaven as it could. End quote. Because a king was crucified on it. The moral of this fanciful story is that each of the trees got what they wanted, just not in the way they had imagined. I thought this story appropriate for the season, and many thanks to Alan for reminding me of it. Good night, sweet dreams, happy Easter. I'm Don Jackson.